This video will be the final video in the series of the Arts of Asia. We'll be looking at some examples of Asian American modernism, including the work of Isamu Noguchi. So we'll look at another example of his work. We'll also look at the work of Ruth Asawa. We'll then move on to China and consider the work of Ai Weiwei. Also look at the work of Korean artist Jun Paik, and then finish up looking at the work of Takashi Murakami and Yayoi Kusama from Japan. So a great variety, a very successful 20th and 21st century artists in this particular video. On the screen, of course, you have one of Yayoi Kusama's infinity rooms that have become so popular in our Instagram culture, and we'll talk more about its meaning in just a little bit. So starting off with Isamu Noguchi, we discussed him in the Japanese Gardens video. He had this heritage, being born of a Japanese father and American mother who was part Irish. So he had this kind of dual heritage. He spent a lot of time in Japan, also in the United States, and also in Europe. He was particularly interested early on in these biomorphic forms, these forms that didn't necessarily represent something specific, but looked to be living in some ways, had a certain organic quality to them. So you can see in this particular figure called Kouros, there's a certain quality that looks living to it. There's also a certain cubist element to it, this idea of reducing forms down to more basic elements. Of course, it's very modernist to do that, this idea of abstraction. And then also, Noguchi was very interested in reducing forms down to more basic elements. The concept of Zen restraint is often discussed in relation to his work. The idea of feats of engineering. His works are quite delicate and often are very delicately balanced, and there's great attention to the materials that he's using. In this case, he's using marble. Kouros, the name Kouros, connects it back to traditions of Greek sculpture, so kind of an interesting connection to ancient European heritage. So we'll talk about that in a little bit in more detail in a couple slides. But to start off, I just wanted to show you a comparison. He did travel to Europe and spend time with Constantine Brancusi in his studio, and did become interested in these abstract forms that had a certain living quality. You see Noguchi's work globular, that even though it's made of this hard polished brass, seems to have almost this softness to it, this quality of bending, this living quality that connects it to this tradition of biomorphic forms, which we see in both sculpture and painting around this time. So I mentioned that the title Kouros connects it to this history of sculptures of koroi, or sculptures of youth, from Greek culture. So I'm just comparing the two. You can see that this one comes from right at the end of World War II, so obviously a very difficult time. So we'll talk about that meaning in just a second, this kind of broken body, but just this idea of creating the connection to a human figure, perhaps a head, the body, the legs, this kind of, again, breaking down to more abstract forms is definitely something that Noguchi is exploring, and again, thinking about the materiality and the engineering of this form. Discussing the engineering, Noguchi explained, "You have to consider the weight of the material, the forces that conspire to hold up the figure, engineering problems essentially. Everything I do has an element of engineering in it, particularly since I dislike gluing parts together or taking advantage of something that is not inherent in the material. There are no adhesives of any kind, only the stones holding themselves together." So I think that's a great statement in terms of his ability to construct and to build, and he seems to have had an interest in this very early on in his career and in his life. I had mentioned how this body, or this Kouros figure, which again means young man in Greek, is perhaps connected to the kind of fragmentary and broken bodies that people were thinking about and considering in the post-World War II world. So thinking about fragmentary and broken bodies, exploring voids, that's definitely something that Noguchi is doing. Somewhat similar to the painting we saw in the previous video by Ishigaki, Disaster by Atomic Bomb. This idea of reflecting on the global trauma of World War II, the incredible number of deaths that had happened during World War II, and the way different artists approached these subjects and dealt with these subjects and this trauma. Just a reminder that in the other video, Japanese Gardens in California, we briefly looked at Isamu Noguchi's California scenario in Costa Mesa from near the end of his career. It was created in 1982, and just thinking about that concept of Zen restraint, not kind of over decorating or over making anything too garish. Moving on to another artist, Ruth Asawa, who was born in California and actually went through the Japanese internment. She was born in Norwalk, California, went through Japanese internment, and then eventually stayed in San Francisco, where she found a number of very important public commissions. She also had a number of children, and while she was busy raising her family, she also began making these looped wire sculptures, along with a lot of other artwork. So she has wonderful drawings and prints, again, these wonderful public artworks, but she's become most known for these looped wire sculptures or woven wire sculptures that are very recognizable whenever you go to a modern art museum or any art museum. So here are just two images of Ruth Asawa with this various type of loop wire sculpture. You can see that she's exploring different geometric forms. Many people associate this with fiber arts, so there was a great interest among female artists engaging in fiber arts and textiles, kind of this idea that women had for a long period been associated with craft and things like basket weaving and the weaving of fabrics. And so in this case, she's kind of taking that idea and playing with ideas also of abstraction and modern and contemporary art. She often used different types of wires, so they kind of rust and take on these different colors over time. She often would have these shapes that would hover within the looped wire, so you can see that here and here. And what I always find interesting is seeing how museums display these works. They often have different display strategies for how they're going to show Ruth Asawa's looped wire sculptures. So this is how they're displayed in the Young Museum in San Francisco. So kind of often an alcove where you can take an elevator up to the view deck. There are a number of these sculptures that are hovering or hanging, and then they're lit so that they create these wonderful shadows within the corner. At the Whitney Museum of American Art, one of Asawa's sculptures is hanging so that you get this wonderful view of the skyline of Manhattan in the back. So there are these very different approaches that can be taken in displaying her work. And sometimes it's displayed as a single sculpture, and then sometimes there are multiples grouped together, as we saw with the De Young Museum. As I mentioned, she also received a number of public art commissions in the Bay Area. So there's a more representational fountain of a mermaid at Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco. And then also she created a number of fountains that are reminiscent of origami or folded paper. And so you can see that with the Buchanan Mall fountain, and then also with the Aurora fountain near the Bay Bridge when it was originally installed. Thinking about an artist with Japanese heritage, Masami Teraoka, he's definitely thinking about ukiyo-e traditions in the way that he represents his subjects in his artwork. And so he's definitely thinking about more representational traditions, and he's thinking about how he can play with those very famous ukiyo-e prints, which have inspired so many artists. So remember, we saw how it inspired post-impressionist artists. Well, they continue to inspire artists up into today. So here we're seeing his version of the Wave series, Tattooed Woman at Kaneohe, from 1984. And so this is a play on a particular shunga print, so one of those more sexual or erotic prints, shunga meaning spring pictures, that's called Dream of the Fisherman's Wife. And this is where a woman has gone into the water and she's suddenly attacked by an octopus that starts performing sexual acts on her. And so here we see a very modern approach to that. So let me just show you this is the Dream of the Fisherman's Wife. So very, very famous example of shunga, this particularly kind of erotic scene where she's couched between the floor of the ocean and then has this larger octopus and smaller octopus kind of having their way with her. In this case, we see Teraoka has a very different way of approaching it. This woman is trying to get the octopus off of her. She definitely doesn't seem to, she's not enjoying this. She has her more modern goggles on. She has her tattoos on. So we definitely are seeing a more modern woman in this particular representation. Here are some additional scenes from that series, and I just have a quote by Teraoka about whether he considers himself to be an American artist. And so he says, definitely yes. If I were living in Japan, I would not have been an artist. I would never have had the chance to appreciate my own culture and ukiyo-e art. It was a matter of the unexpected chance that I was able to detach myself from Japan physically and mentally. freedom I felt in Los Angeles and California was key to my work. So I think that's just an interesting quote, thinking about how artists sometimes, when they are no longer in their home culture, have a new perspective on it and can bring that perspective into the artwork. Another one of his series I just think is kind of funny. This one is from the 1970s, called McDonald's Hamburgers Invading Japan. So this kind of commentary of the kind of woman you might see in a ukiyo-e print, the kind of courtesan figure who seems disgusted by her hamburger, contrasted with a woman who again has this kind of tattooing, who's eating a bowl of noodles. And so kind of this contrast of Western culture embracing Japanese cuisine and the fact that the Japanese are now forced to eat McDonald's hamburgers. Moving on to Ai Weiwei, who's one of the most important contemporary artists in China, who has faced no shortage of criticism and kind of struggle from being censored by the Chinese government. In fact, he was detained for 3 months in 2011, so there was this whole controversy about his passport being taken away. I'm not even sure if his passport has been given back to him yet. He is based in Beijing, but spent a decade in New York, so definitely has a heavy Western influence and has been definitely exposed to a lot of Western art. So while his art has been greatly appreciated, it also shows this kind of mocking of Chinese culture, which a lot of individuals in China aren't necessarily comfortable with. So one of his most famous series, this kind of triptych, is called Dropping a Han Dynasty Urn. And so we see him in this kind of three-part moment where he's holding the urn, where he's dropping the urn, and where it smashes on the ground. And there's a couple of questions here, like, is he really dropping a Han Dynasty urn? Is this a replica? Is this really what's going on? But obviously it's a show of disrespect in some people's eyes and kind of this mocking of ancient culture and an interesting kind of cultural commentary. We do have other works by Ai Weiwei which show a certain mocking of the Chinese government and some of their practices. There are images, for example, photographs where he's flipping off the Forbidden City and like the Tiananmen Gate. And so just this idea of him mocking Chinese history and the Chinese government. Zooming in on that vase, which is broken at his feet, so you can see the details there. Here I'm just comparing it to an actual Han Dynasty vase. There are a variety of shapes, so obviously the shape is not identical, but just showing you what he's alluding to. And then you have this other more recent exhibition where you see the triptych of him dropping the Han Dynasty urn from the 1990s, and then this newer series, colored vases, where he's taken what you could assume to be Han Dynasty vases and then painted them and dipped them. So you see him at work off to the side. Again, are these really Han Dynasty vases? I'm not 100% sure, but clearly, again, some element of kind of mocking ancient culture. All right, moving on to Korea, looking at the work of Paik Namjoon or Namjoon Paik. That's usually what he's called in Western culture. So again, in Asian culture, usually we have the last name first, and then in Western culture, the last name is last. Here we're seeing his very famous TV Buddha, which I think connects very nicely to some of the Buddhist ideas that we've talked about in the previous video. So this is a TV Buddha from 1974. He created a number of TV Buddhas. So Namjoon Paik was really interested in electronics and TV art. So you can see that a camera is filming the Buddha and then kind of watching itself, and it's encased within this mound of earth. And so some art historians have connected this to the idea of the stupa. So the stupa is supposed to encase the precious relics of the Buddha and symbolize, an important aspect of the Buddha. And then also this idea of enlightenment and meditation. So the Buddha is staring at itself and hopefully reaching this point of enlightenment or great meditation. There's also kind of a humor here that when people watch TV, they can kind of zone out and be meditating in some way on what's on the screen. And so there could be a kind of humorous commentary that's going on here. So that's definitely possible. So here I'm just showing you the TV Buddha again, and then another one of his works called Magnet TV. He's definitely the central figure in early video art, and he was born in Seoul and then died in Miami. He spent time in Japan, Hong Kong, West Germany, and the US. So many people talk about him as this very international artist, but definitely originally from Korea. And he was very interested in just how things work, breaking things down. I mean, using things like the magnet, I think, is especially striking. To think a bit more of the meaning here, some people have asked, like, is this a true Buddhist artwork? So some art historians do believe that with that element of the stupa, that element of meditation, that there actually is a true Buddhist meaning here. And so just to think about the arrangement of items, some art historians have thought about this double appearance of the Buddha, this double appearance here. So as I've already mentioned, it is a meditating image, there is humor, but so as I said, this idea of the double Buddha could connect to the Lotus Sutra, which is that last bullet point on my list here. And the Lotus Sutra is this idea that the Buddha nature is transcendent and eternal, and Gautama, the historical Buddha, is just one manifestation. And so when the Lotus Sutra is taught, this Buddha of the distant past, whose name is Paraptaratna, appears. And so there's this double moment of the Buddha. And so that's what we see in this Chinese work from the 6th century, this double Buddha of the historical Buddha and then Buddha of the distant past. This kind of doubling up of the Buddha could be a particular reference to the Lotus Sutra. So it might be a more traditionally Buddhist work than we assume. So again, I was talking about the mound of earth as connecting to the stupa, and then here's just a representation of the Lotus Sutra where the historical Buddha is here, and then the Buddha of the distant past is encased in this kind of gleaming stupa off to the side. So perhaps a connection to the presence of this second Buddha on the screen within this mound of earth. So a possible interesting Buddhist reading. Here's just another example of the TV Buddha. However, this one does not have that mound of earth. So that's what makes this particular installation so unique, with that mound of earth that surrounds. Another very famous example by Jun Paik is the electronic superhighway, which definitely could be a commentary on the obsession with TV in the United States, the obsession with pop culture, and also some unique features for each individual state. All right, moving on to Japan, looking at the work of Takashi Murakami. So Murakami's work has been incredibly appealing. Much of this is due to the fact that he is interested in exploring Japanese anime or animated cartoons and also manga, and he really does blur the line between fine art and popular culture. He also has been very willing to work with figures in popular culture, so he's done designs for Louis Vuitton, which I'll show you in just a second. He's also collaborated with Kanye West, so that's brought him a lot of exposure. In addition to that, he's definitely interested in looking at Japanese traditions. He talks about super flat, and he does refer to more historical Japanese artists as being inspirations for him. He does explore kind of this flatness in his Japanese screens, and he does use a more traditional kind of screen-like form in some of his work. So you can see 1, 2, 3 screens. You can see the line here and the line here. His works are very kind of approachable because you look at them and you think, oh, that looks kind of like Mickey Mouse. You start to see familiar characters. There's often kind of smiling characters, but there's also this darkness to some of his works, some disturbing qualities to some of his work, some aggressive sexuality to some of his artwork as well. So it's always important to keep that in mind. Here I'm just comparing his work to that wind god screen that we saw previously by Sotatsu from the Edo period, with this idea of those screens that were traditional in Japan and also the flatness of the style, not trying to get too much dimension on these figures. A particularly vivid work that I think exemplifies some of the underlying darkness to these bright and colorful works is Tantanbo Puking, A.K.A. Jiro-tan from 2002. It's a massive work that explores this super flat style. Many people talk about how this is also exploring kind of the underside of otaku, which is basically individuals who are obsessed with computers and popular culture, and then it starts to take over their lives. So there's an interesting social commentary that could be going on here as well. This particular scene where the figure is puking may also connect to a time of where Murakami was going through some illness as well. Here's an example of his collaboration with Louis Vuitton, and this was a pretty big deal because you see this combination of this traditional kind of luxury brand with Louis Vuitton combined with this colorful quality of Murakami that's kind of stamped onto it. So this idea of taking tradition and a very expected type of logo, and then really changing it with new colors and new designs in this type of kind of popular item. Obviously, these were very expensive, so they weren't, they weren't for everyone to purchase, but they were definitely a lot less expensive than a particularly unique, Murakami work. And in fact, in a Murakami retrospective done by the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, there was a gift shop including the Louis Vuitton bags right in the middle of the exhibition, rather than just at the end of the exhibition. So you really had to walk through it, which really exemplified the fact that Murakami is this very commercial artist and that he has partnered with a lot of these commercial brands. Another example of how Murakami has become such a famous global artist is an exhibition at Versailles, the very famous palace of Louis XIV. This exhibition happened in 2010. You can see how in the Hall of Mirrors, some of his sculptures were incorporated into the overall visual presentation. So in this very kind of classical and also dynamic Baroque setting, using a lot of gilding and mirrors, you have these colorful Murakami figures and characters that would appear throughout the hallway. All right, our final work is by Yayoi Kusama, called Infinity Mirrored Room Filled with the Brilliance of Light. This is part of the collection of the Tate Modern in London. It dates to 2012, so very recent. Yayoi Kusama has become incredibly famous just in the last few years and is the most successful living woman artist today. She recently had a documentary that came out about her. She's had a lot of attention. She's very important. What's interesting is Kusama has worked incredibly hard for decades. So going back to the 50s and 60s, she actually moved to New York soon after World War II, even though her family rejected the idea of her becoming an artist. When she was in New York, this was really the place that a lot of artists needed to be. And so she did stay there and she worked incredibly hard. She got to know a number of artists, including Andy Warhol, although their relationship became a little complicated when she felt like he was stealing some of her ideas or some of her exhibition kind of plans. But you do see this commonality in Kusama's work where she does use a lot of these dots and a lot of repetition as well. And so you tend to have this kind of visually overwhelming canvases and then also installations. And then as she moved into her infinity rooms, you get that overwhelming sense as well. Eventually she does move back to Japan. She kind of worked herself sick in certain times of her life. She would work for these incredibly long stretches, and she still has this amazing work ethic into her late 80s, but she really needed to return to Japan. She did suffer from mental illness. It's said that she's also had hallucinations of these dots throughout her life, so these kind of dots that we see in the Infinity Mirrored Room. And eventually she checked herself into a mental or psychiatric institution, and she continues to live in a psychiatric institution today, and she just goes out every day to do her work. So she's most happy and kind of keeps her mental illness at bay by doing work, by creating art. And so she still creates a lot of work. She also finds fashion to be very important. So the way she dresses herself, you can see her in this red polka dot garment and a red wig. This idea that the way she represents herself, she considers that to be very important and kind of part of her art as well. So this idea of the repetition of the dots, many people connect this to hallucinations. She had these kind of looped paintings that she created, infinity net paintings that she created earlier on in her career that have now become very expensive when sold at auction and very popular. But you can see how she's starting to explore this kind of endless polka dot, this endless netting, this kind of endless hallucination that she's trying to control, that she's trying to keep at bay. Here's another example of one of these rooms that's covered in these polka dots. So I'm here but nothing. She sometimes will do these installations multiple times, so you'll sometimes see multiple dates on these particular works. A particular work that she's done many times in different exhibitions of her work is called the Obliteration Room. So the Obliteration Room starts as a kind of typical domestic setting that's pure white. You see it here in the upper right hand corner, and then eventually everyone who visits is given a little paper of stickers, and then they can place these different colored stickers wherever they want within the room, and eventually there's obliteration. There's nothing left. You can't see any details except everything is covered with these polka dots. So really her audience is doing the work for her. A particularly popular infinity room is from 2013, the Infinity Mirrored Room, The Souls of Millions of Light Years Away. It's in the Broad Museum in downtown Los Angeles. This museum opened just a few years ago, so this has become one of the most popular spaces. And this would be a good time to mention that one of the reasons Yayoi Kusama has become so famous is the idea that people, when they go to museums now, want to take a lot of photographs. They want to record everything that they're seeing. And these infinity rooms have become these very popular Instagrammable spaces. So everyone wants to come see them, everyone wants to get their photograph in it, and everyone wants to post it on their social media. And so I think it's just important to think about how the type of art that's popular perhaps has changed based on social media demands. But to think about this particular room, this final key work, one of the main purposes of Kusama's work is to think about a desire for peace. She was an anti-war activist early on. She was a performance artist early on. There's still an element of performance in the fact that she continues to dress up and continues to be very present in some of her openings. And so in this particular case, I think there could be a message of peace here as well, and also just this desire to try to control some of her own personal struggles to create a certain amount of beauty and escape in this particular room. So thank you for watching this series. I hope you enjoyed the Arts of Asia, and I hope to come up with a new idea in the future. Thank you.